The phone connected to the speaker on its own, and before anyone could react, a woman's voice came through clear and calm, saying, "Did you book the hotel with our card or yours?" The sentence hung in the air above the dining table, above the plates of half-eaten food, above my mother's hand frozen around her fork, above my father-in-law, who had been mid-sip and didn't swallow. No one moved. The speaker sat in the center of the table like it had always belonged there, black and small next to the salt shaker, the blue light steady, not flickering, not apologizing. My husband was closest to it. His phone was face down near his elbow. I watched his fingers curl, not reaching, just tightening, as if the decision to grab it or not was happening somewhere behind his eyes. The room stayed silent in a way that felt procedural, like everyone was waiting for instructions that never came. I didn't say anything. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the speaker because if I looked anywhere else, I knew I would break the stillness first, and I didn't want that responsibility. My sister-in-law shifted in her chair, the wood scraping softly against the floor, then stopped when her husband put a hand on her knee. My mother cleared her throat and then didn't speak. The woman's voice didn't come back. The phone didn't disconnect. The blue light stayed on. It felt like time had slowed to something measurable, like seconds were now objects you could stack on the table next to the dishes. Finally, my husband reached out and pressed a button, too hard, and the light went dark. He laughed once, sharp and short, and said it was nothing, just a glitch. These things always connect to the wrong device. No one answered him. He picked up his phone and slid it into his pocket, standing up too quickly so his chair tipped and hit the wall behind him. He steadied it and said he needed some air. The back door closed behind him. The sound of it echoed more than it should have. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the heat from the food I hadn't touched in the last 5 minutes. My father-in-law asked if anyone wanted more water. My mother said she was fine. My sister-in-law stared at the empty space where the speaker had been, as if it might turn back on by itself. I reached forward and turned it off completely, holding the power button until the light disappeared for good, then set it on the counter by the sink. The plastic felt warm in my hand. I went back to my seat. The meal resumed in pieces, conversations restarting without direction, but everything sounded off, like people were talking through a wall. I nodded when spoken to. I smiled when expected. I didn't bring it up. I didn't need to. The question was already sitting between us, heavier than the dishes. When my husband came back in, his face was flushed. He avoided my eyes and poured himself a drink without asking if anyone else wanted one. He talked louder than before, about work, about traffic, about nothing. I watched the way he kept his phone turned inward on the counter, screen down, even when it buzzed once near the end of the meal. I watched the way his mother noticed it too and then looked away. After dessert, as plates were cleared and coats were gathered, my sister-in-law hugged me longer than usual and whispered, "Call me," like it was a favor she was offering, not a request. In the car on the way home, neither of us spoke. The radio stayed off. At a red light, his phone buzzed again. He didn't reach for it. I did. I didn't open it. I just picked it up and placed it in the cup holder between us, screen up this time. He stared straight ahead until the light turned green. When we pulled into the driveway, he said we'd talk tomorrow, that tonight was not the time. I nodded and got out of the car first, taking my bag with me, leaving the phone where it was. Inside the house, I went to the kitchen and set my keys down next to the mail. The silence followed me in, settled into the corners, waited. I knew then that whatever had come through that speaker wasn't an accident that could be explained away. It was a procedural error. Something had slipped out before it was ready, and now it couldn't be put back. The morning after the dinner, he acted as if the house had reset itself overnight, like whatever had happened had been contained to that room and those witnesses and had no jurisdiction here. So he made coffee, clattered the mug too loudly on the counter, and asked if I wanted eggs, his voice steady in a way that felt practiced, not calm. And when I said no, he shrugged and said he was running late anyway, already reaching for his keys, already halfway out of the conversation before it could begin. I watched him move through the kitchen with a new awareness of where he placed things, how he angled his phone face down by the sink, how he picked it up whenever he crossed the room as if it were something fragile that needed constant supervision, and when it buzzed, he stepped into the hallway to check it, closing the door behind him even though no one else was awake. After he left, I stood at the counter longer than I needed to, the coffee going cold in my cup, listening to the house settle, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car door slamming 2 houses down, all of it too ordinary for what was sitting under my skin. I didn't chase him. I didn't call anyone. I cleaned up from the night before, loading the dishwasher, wiping down the table where the speaker had sat, my hand pausing on the wood as if there might still be a trace of that moment there, something I could feel if I pressed hard enough. By mid-morning, my phone lit up with a message from him asking if we could talk later, adding a smiley face like that might soften the words, and I replied with a simple, okay, nothing more, nothing that gave him anything to lean against. When he came home that evening, he brought takeout like a peace offering, setting the bags down carefully, lining the containers up on the counter as if presentation mattered, and he started talking before I had even taken off my coat, saying the speaker thing was embarrassing but harmless, that technology does weird stuff sometimes, that whoever it was must have been calling at the exact wrong moment. He laughed again, the same sharp laugh from the night before, and asked if I really thought he would be that careless, using our card for something like that, saying it out loud in front of everyone, and I noticed how he kept saying something like that instead of naming it. I sat at the table and opened one of the containers, the smell of food filling the room, grounding me, and I asked him who the woman was. He didn't answer right away. He picked up his fork, set it down, picked it up again, then said he didn't know what I was talking about, that voices sound similar over speakers, that maybe I was projecting because the situation was awkward. He said awkward a few times, like if he repeated it enough it would replace whatever else the word could be. I asked him again, slower this time, and he sighed, rubbing his forehead, saying I was making it bigger than it needed to be, that it was one sentence, one glitch, and that dragging it out was only going to hurt everyone. I watched the way his knee bounced under the table, the way his eyes flicked to the counter where his phone sat, screen down and back to me. He said if I wanted to look at his phone, I could, pushing it toward me with 2 fingers, but when I reached for it, he pulled it back slightly, just enough to register, then corrected himself and slid it all the way across. I didn't touch it. The offer felt like a test, not an invitation. I told him I didn't need to go through his phone to know what I heard, and he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, saying hearing something and understanding it were 2 different things, that I should be careful not to accuse him of things that could spiral, his word, spiral, hanging there like a warning. Over the next few days, the denial didn't disappear, it just changed shape, became more efficient, more tailored to the moment. So when my sister-in-law called and asked if everything was okay, he said yes loudly enough for me to hear from the other room, adding that families always overreact to tech mishaps, that it was a generational thing, and when I came into the room he smiled at me and put the call on speaker, inviting me into the conversation like there was nothing to hide. At night, he scrolled on his phone in bed with the brightness turned all the way down, thumb moving in short, precise motions, and when I shifted he locked the screen instantly, rolling over and saying he was just reading the news. I started noticing small things that didn't add up. Not evidence, not yet, just friction, like the way he suggested we skip our usual grocery store and stop somewhere else because it was on the way, even though it wasn't. Or how he insisted on paying cash for takeout when we had always put it on the card, laughing it off as him trying to be old school. One afternoon, a package arrived while he was at work, a slim box with his name on it, and I left it by the door where it sat until he got home, unopened, watching his shoulders tense when he saw it, the relief that crossed his face when he realized it was just a replacement charger. He said, "See?" Like that settled something. The word "see" landed wrong, too final for how early it was, and that night when we sat on opposite ends of the couch, the TV on but muted, he told me he felt like he was being watched in his own house, that my silence was louder than any accusation, and I watched him say it with a straight face, claiming the space of the injured party. I didn't argue. I folded a blanket and set it between us, a small physical boundary that he noticed immediately, shifting to reclaim the armrest like it mattered. The denial stretched on, not explosive, not dramatic, just persistent, like a low hum you can't locate, and by the end of the week it had done its job, creating a new normal where the question from the speaker was treated as an anomaly, a joke we didn't repeat, something impolite to mention. On Friday evening, as we were getting ready to go out, his phone buzzed on the bathroom counter while he was in the shower, the sound sharp in the quiet, and I didn't pick it up, didn't look at the screen, just turned the faucet off in the sink to drown it out. standing there longer than necessary, waiting for it to stop on its own. When it finally did, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, not because of what I knew, but because of what he was so determined to pretend I hadn't heard. And as we left the house, locking the door behind us, I noticed the way he checked his pocket twice for his phone, a habit that had formed fast, and I realized that whatever had connected to that speaker hadn't just slipped out. It had forced him into a posture he couldn't relax out of anymore. And that posture was going to cost someone something soon, even if he refused to say what. By the third week after the dinner, the house had settled into a routine that looked normal from the outside, but felt misaligned in small, persistent ways. Like furniture shifted an inch to the left so you kept bumping your hip without knowing why. And most of that misalignment showed up around money and time, the two things we used to talk about without thinking. On Monday mornings, I paid the bills at the kitchen counter like I always had, laptop open, mail stacked to my right, coffee cooling to my left, and I noticed how he lingered nearby now, pretending to wipe an already clean surface or refill his mug, hovering just close enough to glance at the screen without asking. His presence a pressure rather than company. When I logged into our shared account, he asked casually what I was doing, and I said bills, the same answer I'd given for years. But this time he nodded too quickly and said we should maybe switch things up, spread responsibilities around, as if the system we'd used forever had suddenly become inefficient. I clicked through the usual payments, utilities, insurance, groceries, and everything looked ordinary at first glance, amounts I could almost predict before they loaded. But one date caught my eye, not because of the number, which was unremarkable, but because of when it posted, a midweek charge on a night he'd told me he was working late, the kind of late that came with an apology text and a promise to bring leftovers home. I didn't stop. I didn't click deeper. I just noted it, the way you note a car parked where it shouldn't be, registering it without acting. Later that day, he texted asking if I could pick up a few things from the store, sending a list that included items we already had, and when I said so, he replied with a thumbs up and nothing else, the conversation ending abruptly, and at dinner he ate without comment, eyes flicking to his phone whenever it buzzed, then back to his plate. Over the next few days, the friction multiplied in small ways, like how he suggested we delay booking our summer trip because prices were unpredictable, his word, unpredictable, even though we'd already chosen dates, or how he insisted we split checks when we went out with friends, laughing that it was simpler, even though it never had been before. On Thursday, I found myself standing in the laundry room holding a receipt I didn't remember seeing before, tucked into his jeans pocket, not dramatic, just gas and a snack from a place off the highway, but dated for a day he'd supposedly worked from home, and I put it back where I found it, smoothing the fabric as if that would smooth over the question forming in my head. We spoke less, not in an angry way, just less. Conversations trimmed down to logistics, who was picking up what, who would be late, who had a meeting, and when my sister-in-law texted asking if I wanted to grab coffee, he said she was probably just bored, dismissing the idea before I could answer. His tone light but his eyes watchful. One evening, as I was making dinner, he leaned against the counter and asked if I was okay, really okay, emphasizing the word like it was a diagnostic tool, and I said I was fine, because fine was accurate enough, and he nodded, satisfied, as if the answer confirmed something he needed. The date from the bank account stayed with me, not as proof, not as accusation, but as a reference point. So when he mentioned offhand that he'd been out with coworkers that same night, I asked where they'd gone, and he named a place across town without hesitation, too quickly, and I let it pass, noting the mismatch between the location and the charge, between the story and the record, the way you notice two puzzle pieces that almost fit but don't. By the weekend, the routine had shifted enough that it was noticeable even to him, because he commented on it, saying things felt tense, asking if we could just move on. His voice edged with impatience, and I watched him say it while setting his phone face down on the table, aligning it carefully with the edge, as if control could be imposed by precision. On Sunday afternoon, we went to his parents' house again, a smaller gathering this time, just coffee and dessert, and the memory of the speaker hovered unspoken between us, but no one mentioned it, everyone polite to the point of strain. And when his mother asked how work was going, he launched into details, too many details, filling the space with information like he was patching a hole. On the drive home, he said it had been a rough few weeks and asked if we could reset, his word, reset, and I nodded because nodding was easier than arguing in a moving car, but my attention drifted to the calendar on my phone, scrolling back to that midweek night, lining it up with his explanation, with the text he'd sent, with the charge I'd seen, and the lines didn't converge. That night, as I brushed my teeth, I heard his phone vibrate on the counter behind me, once, then again, and I didn't turn around, didn't need to see it to know he was watching my reflection, gauging whether I would react. And when I finished and left the bathroom, he picked it up immediately, stepping into the hallway to answer, lowering his voice, even though no one else was awake. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between his words, the pauses too measured to be casual, and when he came back he slid under the covers without comment, facing away from me, the space between us wider than it had ever been in inches. The next morning, as I marked a date on the wall calendar for an appointment weeks away, I noticed how many of our recent disagreements circled back to timing, to nights that ran late, to expenses that appeared out of rhythm, and I realized the question wasn't whether something had happened, but how often, and whether the pattern would keep tightening on its own if I did nothing, because already the dates weren't lining up, and patterns don't stay quiet forever. The first real crack showed up on a Tuesday afternoon when I logged into the account again, not because I was hunting for anything, but because the electric bill was due, and the calendar reminder popped up like it always did, and this time when the page loaded, there was a pending charge sitting there that hadn't been there the night before. A hotel name I recognized only because it was near the airport, the kind of place you pass on the highway and never think about again, and the amount wasn't outrageous, which almost made it worse, because it blended in, looked reasonable, like it belonged. I stared at it longer than I needed to, watching the status sit there as pending, knowing that once it cleared it would feel more permanent, more official, and I took a screenshot without thinking too hard about it. The sound of the capture sharp in the quiet kitchen, my finger hovering for a second afterward as if I might undo it by not moving. When he came home that night, he was in a good mood, humming to himself as he dropped his bag by the door, talking about a meeting that had gone well. And I watched him move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who believed the ground was still solid, setting his phone down by the sink, screen down, the same careful placement as always. Over dinner, I asked him how his day had been, and he told me, adding details I hadn't asked for, names, timelines, locations, and I nodded at the right moments, waiting for an opening that didn't come, because he filled every pause with something else. After we finished eating, I carried my plate to the sink and said casually that I'd been paying bills earlier and noticed a charge I didn't recognize, keeping my voice even, my back to him as I rinsed the dish, giving him the option to respond without being watched. There was a brief pause, the kind that stretches just enough to register, and then he said it was probably a mistake, that hotels sometimes pre-authorize cards, that he'd stayed near the airport once for a conference months ago, and charges can lag, his explanation sliding out smoothly, already formed. I turned around and asked which conference, and he shrugged, said he couldn't remember. There were so many, and I felt something shift then, not dramatically, just a tightening, because forgetting would have been believable if he hadn't been so quick to offer the reason in the first place. I told him the charge was dated for last week, and he laughed lightly, waving a hand, saying dates online are unreliable, that banks batch things strangely, and he asked if I wanted him to call the bank to straighten it out, offering action instead of clarity. I said no, that it was fine, that I just wanted to ask. And he nodded, relief flickering across his face before he masked it, turning his attention to his phone when it buzzed, picking it up and stepping into the hallway as if drawn by a string. I stood at the counter and watched the water run over my hands, hotter than necessary, letting the moment pass without pushing it further, because something about his eagerness to explain had answered more than his words had. Over the next 2 days, the pending charge stayed pending, a small, unresolved thing sitting in the account like a placeholder, and I checked it more often than I needed to, each time feeling a small jolt of recognition, like seeing the same stranger on the bus every morning. He adjusted his behavior around it without knowing that I knew, insisting we skip eating out, suggesting we cook instead, offering to cover small expenses with cash, framing it as budgeting, as responsibility, and I watched him perform restraint in ways he hadn't before, as if compensating for something already spent. On Thursday morning, my sister-in-law texted again, asking if I wanted to talk, and I said maybe later, because I wasn't ready to say anything out loud yet. Wasn't ready to make the screenshot more than a file on my phone. That afternoon, the charge cleared, the word pending disappearing, and replaced by a posted date, firm and undeniable. And I felt a strange mix of relief and dread, because uncertainty had been doing some of the work for me, and now it was gone. I took another screenshot, this one of the posted transaction, and saved it in a folder I renamed Bills, a neutral word that didn't draw attention if someone glanced at my phone. When he got home, he was quieter than usual, distracted, checking his phone more often, and when I mentioned the cleared charge, he sighed heavily, like a man tired of being questioned, and said again that it was nothing, that if I wanted he'd dispute it, but that it seemed silly to waste time on something so minor, and the word minor landed wrong, too dismissive for a shared account, for shared money. I asked him why he was so sure it was nothing if he didn't know what it was for, and he looked at me for a long moment, his jaw tightening, before saying that relationships require trust, that constantly scrutinizing each other's spending was unhealthy, that he felt like he was on trial in his own home. I listened without interrupting, noting how quickly he moved from explanation to accusation, how the focus shifted from the charge to my behavior, and when he finished I said I trusted facts more than reassurances, a simple statement that made his eyes narrow slightly. That night, after he fell asleep, his phone lit up on the nightstand with a notification, the screen flashing just long enough for me to see the preview line, not a name, just a message asking if everything was okay, and I turned away, pulling the covers up, choosing not to reach for it, because I didn't need to anymore. The screenshot existed. The date existed. The pattern was forming, whether he acknowledged it or not, and as I lay there listening to his breathing even out, I understood that this wasn't about catching him in a lie in the moment. It was about waiting until the accumulation of small, reasonable denials collapsed under their own weight. And I knew that when that happened, it wouldn't be in private, because things that begin by connecting themselves to a speaker don't end quietly. By the time Friday came around, the house felt like it was operating under a quiet restriction I hadn't announced but had started enforcing without words, a pressure system built from pauses, from things I no longer volunteered, from questions I didn't ask, even when they hovered at the back of my throat. He noticed it immediately. He always did. That night, when he suggested ordering in, I said we had food already, gesturing to the refrigerator without opening it, and he hesitated before agreeing, as if recalculating something, then offered to cook instead, pulling ingredients out with exaggerated care, narrating his movements like he was being observed. I sat at the table and answered emails, listening to the sizzle of the pan, the clink of utensils, the ordinary soundtrack of dinner, and when his phone buzzed on the counter, he didn't pick it up right away, waiting a beat too long, then sliding it into his pocket instead of checking it where it lay. Over the weekend, he tried different approaches, none of them direct, all of them testing the edges of whatever boundary he sensed had moved. On Saturday morning, he asked if I wanted to go for coffee like we used to, naming our old place as if nostalgia could reset things, and when I said I had errands, he offered to come along, hovering by the door with his keys in hand, then backing off when I didn't respond. At the grocery store later, I paid with the card like I always had, and I felt his eyes on me as the total rang up, watching the screen instead of the cashier, and when I put the receipt into my bag instead of handing it to him, he opened his mouth like he might say something, then closed it again. That small act seemed to shift something, because from then on he started delaying, putting off things that required shared access, saying he'd handle it later, that there was no rush, that we could sort it out after the weekend. His language full of pauses and extensions, like time itself was a resource he could spend to avoid something else. On Sunday afternoon, I asked him if he'd moved money between accounts recently, keeping my voice neutral, and he said no immediately, too immediately, then added that if I needed anything I should just tell him, framing it as generosity instead of transparency. I nodded and went back to folding laundry, aligning towels carefully, one edge at a time, letting the question sit unanswered in the room. That evening, a notification popped up on my phone from the bank, a routine alert about account activity, and when I opened it, there was a brief message about a login attempt from a new device. Nothing dramatic, just a line of text with a timestamp. And I didn't mention it, but I saw him glance at my screen and then away, his jaw setting, as if he'd just been reminded of something. The next few days followed the same pattern, a careful dance where he tried to regain control by slowing everything down, by making access feel optional, by framing my quiet as hostility, telling me on Tuesday night that living like this was exhausting, that he felt like he was being punished without knowing the charge, and I watched him say it while standing in the doorway, blocking my path just slightly, enough to be felt, and I stepped around him without answering, brushing past with my shoulder, a small movement that made him turn and watch me like I'd done something unexpected. On Wednesday, I needed to schedule a payment for the following week, something routine, and when I logged in, I found my access lagging, the page taking longer to load, then prompting me to re-enter information I hadn't needed to re-enter before, and when I mentioned it offhand, he said the system was probably updating, that banks were always changing things, offering explanation before I asked for one, and then he said he could take care of it if I wanted, his voice light, helpful, and I said no, I'd manage, and watched his expression tighten just a fraction. That night, he stayed up later than usual, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, papers spread out in a way that looked busy but unproductive, and when I walked through to get water, he closed the screen halfway, then opened it again, as if deciding which version of himself to present. I went to bed without comment, and when he finally came in, he lay stiffly on his side, the space between us deliberate. On Thursday morning, as I grabbed my bag to leave, he asked if we could talk that evening, really talk, and I said maybe, the same answer I'd given before, and he nodded like he'd expected it, already adjusting. By then, the pressure had built into something tangible, not loud, not explosive, just persistent, and I could feel him trying to outweigh it, to starve it of confrontation until it dissolved, not realizing that every delay, every denied access, every procedural excuse was doing the opposite, narrowing the space until there would be no way to move without something breaking. That afternoon, another bank alert came through, this one confirming a security change, and I read it twice, then locked my phone and set it down, feeling the shift settle in my chest, because whatever he thought he was controlling by slowing things down, he was also leaving a trail, one that didn't require me to raise my voice or accuse him of anything, just to keep going, to let the pressure do its work, because the more he tried to contain it, the clearer it became that access itself had become the leverage. And once that changed, the conversation would no longer be optional. The meeting got scheduled on a Wednesday, not because either of us said the word meeting out loud, but because he sent a calendar invite that popped up on my phone mid-morning with the title, Talk, no location, no notice, just a time block carved out at the end of the day, like an appointment you couldn't reschedule without consequence. I accepted it without comment, watching the confirmation checkmark appear, and felt something settle into place because this was the first time he'd put anything in writing instead of relying on implication or tone. All day, the hours moved with a strange steadiness, every routine intact, every task completed, but underneath it there was a sense of compression, like the walls were inching inward without anyone touching them. When I came home, he was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop closed, his phone placed neatly on top of it, screen down but centered, aligned with the edge like it had been measured. He stood when I walked in, too quickly, and asked how my day was, the question landing flat, already obsolete. I set my bag down and said fine, then pulled out a chair and sat across from him, placing my hands on the table so he could see them, empty, not holding anything, and he took a breath like he was about to launch into something rehearsed. He started by saying he wanted to clear the air, that the last few weeks had felt strained, that he hated feeling like there were things unsaid between us, and I watched him talk while my attention drifted to the phone, to the faint smudge on the screen where his thumb usually rested, to the way he kept glancing at it even as he spoke. When he finished his opening, I didn't respond right away. I asked him instead to walk me through last Tuesday night, the one with the airport hotel charge, just the timeline, nothing else, and he blinked, then laughed softly, saying we'd already been over that it was a mistake, a lag, a technical thing, and I nodded and said I understood, but asked him to walk me through it anyway. He shifted in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, and began listing events, meetings, a late dinner with coworkers, traffic, his voice steady but his details vague, places named without specifics, times rounded off, And when he finished, I asked him which coworker he'd been with. Just one name. And he hesitated for half a second before giving one, a pause small enough he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching me so closely. I said okay and opened my phone, not showing him the screen yet, just waking it so the light came on, and told him I'd been tracking expenses because the account had sent a few alerts recently, security-related, and his posture changed then, his shoulders drawing back, his jaw tightening, and he asked what kind of alerts, his voice careful. I told him about the login notification from the new device, about the security change confirmation, and about how access had felt slower, different, and he leaned forward, palms flat on the table, saying he'd meant to mention that he'd been trying to tidy things up, consolidate, make our finances simpler, and I watched the way he used the word "our" while describing actions I hadn't been consulted on. I asked him if he'd changed any permissions, and he said no directly, then amended it, saying not really, that the bank sometimes prompts updates automatically, and I let that sit for a moment before saying I'd called the bank that afternoon, not to dispute anything, just to ask about the alerts, and the color drained from his face in a way he couldn't fully hide. He asked what they'd said, and I told him they'd confirmed a manual change to account access, initiated from a device that wasn't mine, dated for the same week as the hotel charge, and the room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than the night the speaker had gone off. Because this silence wasn't accidental, it was the absence of denial. He stared at the table, then back at me, and said I was making connections that didn't exist, that stress was getting to me, that finances were complicated, and I slid my phone across the table then, screen up, showing him the dates lined up, the notifications stacked in order, not commentary, just records, and I watched his eyes move over them, his breathing shallow, his hand hovering over the phone without touching it. He said this wasn't fair, that he'd been trying to protect us from unnecessary worry, that he hadn't wanted to involve me until he had things sorted, and I asked him sorted how, and with whom, and he didn't answer. The compression I'd felt all day finally reached its limit then, not exploding, just tightening to the point where there was no room left to maneuver, and I told him we needed to address this with witnesses, not tonight, but soon, because whatever had started as a private lie had already crossed into shared space, shared money, shared reputation, and pretending otherwise wasn't an option anymore. He shook his head, saying that would be humiliating, that family didn't need to be dragged into it, and I said quietly that the family had already been involved the moment the speaker turned on, the moment our card got used, the moment access changed without my consent, and that what happened next would either happen with clarity or continue happening without it. He looked at me for a long time, searching for something that wasn't there anymore, and finally asked when, and I said soon, and stood up, ending the meeting without ceremony, because the decision had already been made, and all that remained was to let the process move forward, now that denial had run out of room. The family gathering happened on a Sunday afternoon, framed as casual, low stakes, just coffee and dessert at his parents' house, the kind of thing no one cancels without explanation, and we arrived on time with a box of pastries balanced between us, his hand steady on the steering wheel, mine resting in my lap, both of us performing normal well enough to pass. Inside, the living room smelled like brewed coffee and something sweet, voices overlapping, chairs already pulled into a loose circle, and I noticed immediately how many people were there, more than usual, his sister and her husband, his parents, an aunt who lived nearby, the space filled with the kind of familiarity that makes silence conspicuous. We took our seats, the pastries set on the table, plates passed around, and for the first few minutes the conversation stayed safely shallow. Weather, work, a neighbor's renovation, and I watched him lean into it, laughing at the right moments, refilling cups, positioning himself as attentive and relaxed. When his mother asked how we were doing, the question broad enough to be harmless, he answered quickly, saying busy but good, and reached for my hand like punctuation, his fingers warm, insistent, and I let him hold it without squeezing back. I waited until there was a natural lull, until someone stood to get more coffee, until the rhythm slowed just enough to make interruption feel deliberate. And then I asked a simple question, my voice even, directed at him, but audible to everyone, about the hotel near the airport, and why our card had been used there. The room didn't freeze dramatically. It tilted, conversations tapering off, attention redirecting, heads turning in small increments, and he laughed reflexively, the sound too loud for the space, saying that had already been explained, that it was a mistake, a billing error, and I nodded and said I'd thought so too until I called the bank and confirmed it wasn't. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, glancing around as if assessing the room, recalculating, and his father shifted in his chair, clearing his throat, while his sister's eyes moved between us, sharp, alert. I kept going, not raising my voice, not adding commentary, just stating that the charge had cleared, that it matched a night he hadn't been home, that there had also been a manual change to account access that same week, and the words landed with a weight I hadn't felt in private, because here they had witnesses, people who understood what shared money meant, what procedure implied. He said this wasn't the place for it, that family time shouldn't be turned into an interrogation, and I agreed, saying I hadn't planned it that way, but that the issue had already entered family space weeks ago and pretending otherwise hadn't helped. His mother looked at him then, really looked, and asked quietly what was going on, and the shift in authority was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, because the question didn't come from me anymore. He tried to deflect, saying finances were complicated, that he'd been trying to manage stress, that none of it meant what it sounded like, and I watched the explanations pile up without connecting, each one slightly misaligned with the last, until his sister asked if he'd used the card without telling me, and he hesitated long enough for the answer to be clear, even before he said no. I reached into my bag and took out my phone, not waving it around, just holding it up briefly so those closest could see the bank notifications lined up by date, and then I set it back down, the gesture controlled, restrained, not a flourish, and the effect was immediate, the room quieting in a way that felt earned rather than forced. His father leaned forward, elbows on his knees, asking him directly why there had been a hotel charge and a security change in the same week, and for the first time since the speaker incident, he didn't have a ready response. His gaze dropping to the floor, his hand rubbing the back of his neck like he was buying time he no longer had. Someone's cup clinked against a saucer. The clock on the wall ticked audibly. He said he'd been trying to handle something privately, that he hadn't wanted to worry anyone, that it wasn't as simple as it looked, and his mother said that using shared money without explanation was simple enough to understand, her tone calm but firm. I sat back then, letting the questions come from elsewhere, letting the focus shift, because this was the public part, the moment where denial lost its insulation, where other voices entered the space and stayed. He looked at me once, a brief glance that carried frustration and something like fear, and I met it without expression, my hands folded, my posture steady, and when his sister asked what he planned to do about the charge, he said he'd take care of it, that he'd make it right, and I nodded, acknowledging the statement without praising it. The gathering wound down not with resolution but with discomfort, people leaving earlier than planned, hugs lingering, eyes avoiding, and as we walked back to the car, the air felt thicker, quieter, the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. He didn't speak on the drive home. Neither did I, but the shift had happened, publicly, with witnesses, and the pressure that had been contained to our house had moved outward, where it couldn't be managed by delay or explanation anymore. The days after the gathering moved differently, as if the air itself had been disturbed and hadn't settled back into place yet, and that disturbance followed us into every room, every conversation, every ordinary exchange that now carried an edge. He tried to act as though nothing had changed, waking early, making coffee, offering to run errands, but the effort showed in the way he watched me, waiting for cues, calibrating his tone, and in the way his phone never left his hand for more than a few minutes at a time. Word didn't spread loudly, not the way gossip does when it's fed, but it traveled anyway, quietly, through side conversations and follow-up texts, his sister checking in to ask if I was okay, his mother calling to say she hoped things would get sorted out, the phrasing careful, non-accusatory, but the implication clear that sorting it out now involved more than just the two of us. At home, he became more cooperative on the surface, volunteering information he hadn't been asked for, mentioning meetings, sharing schedules, narrating where he was going and why, but the transparency felt rehearsed, too complete, like a script designed to preempt questions rather than answer them. I listened without interrupting, letting the words accumulate, because the contrast between what he said and what had already been documented was doing its own work. One evening, he brought up the charge again, saying he'd looked into it and was confident it could be reversed, that the hotel had flexible policies, that it was just a matter of time, his language shifting toward resolution without offering proof, and I asked him when he planned to start the process. He said soon, the same word he'd used before, and I nodded, not pushing, because soon now had an audience beyond me, and delay carried a different cost. The social pressure made itself felt in small ways, like how his father called him directly instead of going through me, asking practical questions about the account, about next steps, about timelines, and how he answered with shorter sentences than usual, his confidence thinning under scrutiny that wasn't emotional but procedural. On Wednesday, his sister stopped by unannounced, a brief visit framed as dropping something off, but she lingered in the kitchen, her eyes flicking between us, and asked him directly if he'd contacted the bank yet, the question casual in tone but not in intent, and he said he was working on it, that these things take time. And she nodded, satisfied enough for the moment, but the expectation hung there after she left, filling the space she'd vacated. That night, I noticed him on his laptop longer than usual, tabs open, paperwork spread out, the performance of action louder now, and when I passed behind him to get a glass of water, he minimized a screen quickly, then reopened it, pretending nothing had happened, and I didn't comment, because the pattern was already clear. By Friday, the pressure had shifted from suggestion to expectation. His mother texting both of us asking if the charge had been resolved yet, the inclusion deliberate, and he replied with a vague update about ongoing communication, while I said nothing, letting his words stand on their own. At dinner that night, he asked if I could back him up, tell them we were handling it privately, and I looked at him for a moment before saying that I'd already done that for weeks, that privacy hadn't resolved anything yet, and he flinched, not dramatically, just enough to show the comment had landed. Over the weekend, the subject of money surfaced more often, not just between us but around us. Casual remarks from family about budgeting, about shared accounts, about being careful, each one a reminder that what he'd done had crossed a line everyone understood without needing it explained. He responded by tightening his control over the narrative, insisting he had a plan, that things would be corrected, that people needed to trust him. And I watched how the word trust came up again and again, pressed into service as a shield rather than offered as something mutual. On Sunday evening, as we sat in the living room with the TV on low, he said he felt ganged up on, that mistakes were being treated like moral failures, that he was embarrassed, and I told him embarrassment wasn't the same as accountability, a simple distinction that left him staring at the floor, his foot tapping against the rug in short, agitated movements. The next morning, a bank notification came through confirming that a dispute process had been initiated, not completed, just started, and I read it twice, noting the date, the reference number, the language careful and conditional, and when I mentioned it to him, he nodded quickly, saying, "See, it was in motion," relief flooding his voice as if motion itself were enough. I didn't respond, because motion without outcome had become familiar, and by then the pressure had moved beyond the charge itself, beyond the hotel, into the question of what would happen next if the process stalled, if excuses replaced results again. Later that day, his father called and asked when the refund would post, not if, when, and the question cut through the remaining ambiguity because it assumed a conclusion that hadn't yet arrived. He answered with another soon, his voice strained, and when he hung up, he rubbed his face with both hands, exhaling sharply, and said this couldn't go on, that he needed space to fix it without everyone watching. I said quietly that everyone was watching because the fix involved shared money and shared trust, and that the watching would stop when the outcome arrived. The room went still then, not tense, just settled, like a decision had been acknowledged. And as I turned off the TV and stood to go to bed, I knew the next step wouldn't be another explanation or another delay, but something concrete, something that would either land or fail publicly, because the pressure had escalated past the point where intention mattered, and the only thing left that could shift it was proof. By the time I started consolidating everything, it felt less like digging and more like organizing what had already surfaced on its own, the way debris floats after a storm instead of staying buried, and I did it at the kitchen counter on a quiet Tuesday evening, laptop open, phone beside it, a legal pad pulled close. the house empty except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock that had become more noticeable in recent weeks. I wasn't looking for new proof. I was aligning what existed, putting dates next to dates, charges next to explanations, alerts next to behavior, and the picture that formed didn't rely on interpretation, just sequence. The airport hotel charge sat at the center, no longer pending, no longer disputable as a glitch, flanked by the login alert from the unfamiliar device, the confirmation of the access change, the calendar invite he'd sent for talk, and the texts he'd used to explain his absence that night, each item time-stamped, each one ordinary on its own, but together forming a pattern that didn't require me to raise my voice to be understood. I wrote the dates down carefully, not as a narrative, just as a list, because lists don't argue back. And when I finished, I scanned it once, then again, checking for gaps, for places where his explanations might still fit, and found none. When he came home later that night, he paused when he saw me at the counter, the papers spread out in a way I hadn't done before, and asked what I was working on, his tone cautious, already braced, and I said I was putting things together so we could be clear about next steps. He sighed and set his bag down slowly, like he was trying not to make noise, and said we didn't need to rehash everything, that the dispute was in progress, that dragging it all out was only making things worse, and I told him clarity wasn't dragging, it was preparation. He glanced at the legal pad, then away, and said his parents were upset, that everyone needed reassurance, that he was doing his best, and I asked him when he planned to request the refund formally if the dispute didn't resolve on its own. The question simple. Procedural, and he said he thought the bank would handle it, that hotels complicate things, that policies vary, the answer widening instead of narrowing. I turned the laptop toward him then, not pushing it across, just angling it enough for him to see the transaction history with the date highlighted, the alert stacked below, and said that, if it didn't get refunded, we would request it directly, because shared money didn't disappear into process. He stared at the screen, his mouth tightening, and said that would be embarrassing, that calling the hotel would raise questions, and I said the questions already existed, the only thing missing was resolution. Over the next few days, I refined the timeline, not adding commentary, just precision, noting when he'd said he was working late, when the charge posted, when the access change occurred, when the first denial happened, when the second explanation replaced it, and the more exact it became, the less room there was for reinterpretation. His behavior shifted again, becoming oddly accommodating, offering to cook, to run errands, to handle things he'd previously delayed, as if helpfulness could offset documentation, and I accepted the gestures without acknowledging them, because they didn't address the list sitting quietly in my bag. On Thursday, his sister called and asked how things were going, her voice careful but direct, and I told her we were waiting on a refund, the phrase deliberate, outcome-focused, and she said okay, then added that their parents were asking about it too. Not accusatory, just factual. That evening, he asked me not to involve them anymore, saying it felt like pressure, like he was being judged, and I said pressure was part of accountability when shared resources were involved, that it would ease once the issue was resolved. He didn't argue, but his silence had a sharper edge, and later that night I heard him on the phone in the hallway, his voice low, clipped, repeating that it needed to be handled quickly, that it couldn't drag on, and I recognized the tone, the one he used when he was trying to control an outcome rather than explain it. The following Monday, I called the bank again, not to escalate, just to confirm the status, and they told me the dispute was still under review, that refunds weren't guaranteed, that resolution could take weeks, and I thanked them and ended the call, already knowing what that meant. When he got home, I told him what they'd said, keeping my voice even, and he exhaled sharply, saying weeks was unacceptable, that he'd take care of it himself, and I asked him how, and he said he'd contact the hotel directly. I nodded and said that would be appropriate, and then I told him I would expect confirmation of the refund, not just assurance, and that I'd let his family know we were waiting on it, because they'd asked. He looked at me for a long moment, frustration flickering across his face, then said fine, that he'd handle it, and I said thank you, not as gratitude, but as acknowledgement of the task being named. That night, I put the list back in my bag, zipped it closed, and set it by the door, not hidden, not displayed, just ready. Because the consolidation was complete, the timeline finalized, and the next move wouldn't be another conversation or another explanation. It would be a demand for outcome. one that couldn't be softened by intent or delay. And as I turned off the kitchen light, I understood that once a refund was requested, it wouldn't just resolve a charge. It would force everything else into the open, whether he was ready for that or not. The power shift didn't arrive with a confrontation or a raised voice. It arrived in pieces, procedural and unglamorous, the way real leverage usually does, and it started the morning he told me he'd called the hotel. He said it over coffee like it was a routine update, not looking at me, stirring his mug even after the sugar had dissolved, explaining that he'd spoken to the front desk, then accounting, then a manager, that it had taken a while, that they'd asked questions, and that he'd given them what they needed. I asked him what they'd asked, and he said dates, card numbers, confirmation details. And I nodded, listening for what he didn't say, like whether they'd questioned why our card was used, or who had been present, or whether the reservation had been in his name. And when I asked for the reference number, he hesitated, then said he'd forward it once he had it in writing. The delay was familiar, but this time it didn't stall anything, because the process had moved beyond his timing. That afternoon, his father called me directly, not to accuse, not to interrogate, but to ask if there had been any update, his tone practical, already assuming resolution was the goal, and I told him the hotel had been contacted and we were waiting on confirmation, keeping my words aligned with fact rather than promise. When I hung up, I saw my husband watching me from the doorway, his expression tight, and he asked what his father had wanted, and I told him, and he exhaled slowly, saying this was getting out of hand, that everyone was involved now. And I said everyone was involved because everyone understood what shared money meant, and that the involvement would end when the outcome arrived. Over the next 2 days, he checked his email constantly, refreshing his phone in short bursts, glancing at it during conversations, carrying it from room to room like a tool he couldn't put down, and when nothing came through, his frustration leaked out in small ways, clipped responses, sighs, pacing, the kind of agitation that comes from waiting on something you can't control. On Thursday evening, a message finally arrived from the hotel confirming they were reviewing the request, that documentation had been submitted, that a decision would follow, and he showed it to me immediately, holding the phone out like proof of effort, and I read it carefully, noting the conditional language, the absence of commitment, and said, okay, acknowledging receipt without granting relief. He asked what else I wanted. His voice edged now, and I told him I wanted the refund posted, not processed, not reviewed, posted, and he stared at me for a long moment, then nodded, because there was nothing else to argue against. The next morning, his mother texted asking if there was any news, and he replied before I could, sending her the same update he'd shown me, and she responded with a simple, thank you, adding that she hoped it would be resolved quickly, the word hope carrying a weight it hadn't before. That weekend, we attended another family event, smaller, quieter, and the subject didn't come up directly, but it hovered, visible in the way conversations skirted around finances, in the way eyes flicked toward him when he spoke, and I felt the shift clearly then, not just in him but in how he was being perceived, the subtle downgrade that happens when credibility is under review. On Monday, a bank notification came through confirming a provisional credit had been issued pending final determination, and I read it twice, then forwarded it to him without comment, because it wasn't the end, just a step, and he reacted like it was victory, saying, see, it's coming back, relief flooding his voice. And I said provisional wasn't final, but it was movement, and movement mattered. That afternoon, his father called again, asking what provisional meant, and I explained calmly, not editorializing, just defining the term, and he thanked me, and I could hear the calculation happening on the other end, the understanding that this was now being tracked. 2 days later, the final confirmation arrived. Not dramatic, just an automated email stating the refund had been approved and would post within 24 to 48 hours, and my husband read it out loud like an announcement, looking at me for reaction, for validation. And I nodded, saying, okay, we'll see when it posts. The waiting period that followed was quieter, heavier, because the outcome was imminent, and with it the consequences that couldn't be disputed once the money returned. When the refund finally appeared in the account, posted cleanly with a date and reference number, I took a screenshot and saved it to the same folder as the rest, not because I needed it anymore, but because completion deserved documentation too. He watched me do it and asked if that meant we could move on, his voice hopeful. And I said moving on would involve conversations we hadn't had yet, boundaries that hadn't been set yet, but that the refund mattered, because it acknowledged misuse, even if he never said the word himself. That night, as we sat in the living room, the TV muted, he said he felt exposed, that the whole thing had spiraled beyond what it needed to be, and I told him exposure was what happened when private actions used shared resources, that the spiral had been driven by delay and denial, not by documentation. And he didn't argue, because the power had shifted quietly, definitively, into a place where facts led and explanations followed, and there was no going back to the version of events where intention outweighed outcome. The second public moment didn't come with an announcement or a planned gathering. It came folded into something routine, procedural, unavoidable, the kind of setting where people expect things to be handled cleanly and quietly, and that was exactly why it landed so hard. It happened at his parents' house again, not for a celebration this time, but for a practical reason. A Sunday afternoon where paperwork needed to be signed for a family matter unrelated to us, something administrative that required everyone present, signatures collected, documents passed across the table. We arrived with a folder under his arm, his posture stiff, mine neutral, and the kitchen table was already cleared. Pens laid out, chairs pulled close, the mood businesslike in a way that stripped away any pretense of comfort. His father reviewed the documents one by one. His mother checked names against a list. His sister organized pages into neat stacks, and in the middle of it, as if it belonged there, the topic of the refund surfaced, not emotionally, not dramatically, but as a question of confirmation. His father asked whether the issue with the shared account had been resolved, his tone factual, eyes on the page in front of him, and my husband answered yes, quickly, saying the refund had posted, that it was done. His mother looked up then and asked if we'd received confirmation, not accusatory, just thorough, the way she approached everything, and I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, unlocking it and placing it on the table, screen angled so they could see the transaction line clearly, the amount credited back, the reference number visible, the date stamped. No one gasped, no one raised their voice. The reaction came in the form of silence, the kind that settles when something disputed becomes settled, when there's nothing left to argue about. His sister leaned forward slightly, reading the screen, then nodded once, and his father exhaled. A small sound, relieved but not celebratory, and said, "Okay, good. That's what needed to happen." My husband sat very still, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the table, and for the first time since this had begun, he wasn't explaining or reframing or minimizing. He was simply present, while the consequence was acknowledged by people who mattered to him. His mother thanked me for bringing it, her voice calm, and said she was glad it was resolved, emphasizing the word resolved like it meant something specific, and then she turned back to the paperwork, moving on without ceremony, which was its own kind of judgment. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with that confirmation hanging quietly in the background, not discussed further, not dramatized, but unmistakable, and I watched how it changed the dynamic in small ways, how his father addressed questions to me directly instead of deferring to him, how his sister checked in with me about logistics, how my husband answered when spoken to but didn't volunteer, his usual confidence muted. When we stood to leave, his mother hugged us both and said she hoped things would be simpler going forward, her words careful, non-committal, and in the car afterward, he sat in silence for a long time before saying he felt humiliated, that it hadn't needed to be so public, that everyone now knew things they shouldn't, and I listened without interrupting, watching the road pass by, then said quietly that the money had been used publicly through a shared account, that the resolution had been public because the impact had been public, and that silence hadn't protected him before. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was flat, saying he'd done what was asked, that the refund was back, that this should be over now, and I said the refund addressed the money, not the breach of trust, not the access changes, not the pattern of denial, and that those things didn't disappear just because the account balance had been corrected. At home, he paced the living room, running a hand through his hair, saying he felt like he'd been punished enough, that he was tired of being under scrutiny, that everyone was watching him now, and I said that scrutiny fades when behavior changes consistently, not when a single outcome is achieved. He stopped pacing then and looked at me. Really looked, like he was seeing the shape of what remained, and asked what I wanted, the question stripped of defensiveness for once. I didn't answer immediately. I went to the kitchen, set my bag down, took my phone out, and opened the folder where the screenshots lived, the evidence that had carried us here. And then I closed it, because this moment wasn't about proof anymore. I told him we would talk about boundaries next, about access, about transparency, about what came after a misuse of shared resources, and that conversation wouldn't be private either, not entirely, because accountability had already extended beyond us. He sat down heavily on the couch, the weight of it landing, and asked when, and I said soon, the word different now, specific, backed by action, and I turned off the light in the living room, leaving the room dim and unresolved because the humiliation had already happened, quietly, with witnesses, and the final step wasn't exposure, it was consequence, and that was still waiting. The days after that last visit didn't feel dramatic or loud. They felt procedural, like the aftermath of something official that had already been decided even if it hadn't been announced in full. The house moved into a quieter rhythm, not tense exactly, but careful, every action measured against what had happened and what would happen next. He stopped offering explanations altogether, as if he'd finally understood they no longer carried weight, and instead focused on logistics, asking when bills were due, which account covered what, how we wanted to handle upcoming expenses, the questions practical but stripped of the confidence they used to have. I answered them when they were factual and let the rest sit, because clarity didn't require commentary anymore. The refund sat in the account like a marker, clean and final. The balance restored but not reset. And I checked it once a day at first, then less often, until it became just another line item. Its importance shifted from the number itself to what it represented. Family communication slowed, too, the flurry of concern giving way to a settled awareness that something had changed. His mother texting about unrelated things again, his sister sending a photo of her kids, normalcy resuming with a new undertone, one where I was addressed directly. Decisions routed through me without question. A quiet redistribution of trust that no one named out loud. At home, we had the boundary conversation he'd asked for, not in one sitting, not framed as a confrontation, but broken into smaller, more manageable pieces over a few evenings. Discussions about access, about notifications, about what transparency would look like in practice rather than theory. And I noticed how he listened more than he spoke now, nodding, taking notes on his phone like it was a work meeting, absorbing the fact that this wasn't about reassurance, but structure. I told him what would need to happen for me to feel steady again, not as an ultimatum, just as conditions. And he agreed without pushing back, the lack of resistance itself a sign of how much ground had shifted. There were moments when he looked like he wanted to say more, to explain himself retroactively, to reshape the narrative one last time, but those moments passed without speech, and I let them because the story no longer needed to be revised. One evening, after he'd gone to bed early, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the lights low, the house quiet in the way it only gets late at night, and I opened my bag and took out the printed confirmation the bank had mailed. The formal version of what I'd already seen on the screen. Paper this time, tangible, undeniable. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight despite how thin it was, thinking about how much effort it had taken to arrive at something so ordinary. And then I stood up and walked to the counter. I placed the refund receipt on the kitchen counter and turned off the light. The action felt final in a way words hadn't, not because it erased what came before, but because it marked the end of the process that had consumed weeks of attention and energy. In the dark, I stood there for a moment, listening to the house, to the faint hum of appliances, to the sound of him moving upstairs, and I realized the quiet felt different now, not heavy, not charged, just settled. The next morning, the receipt was still there in the same spot, catching the early light from the window, and he noticed it immediately, pausing when he came into the kitchen, his eyes flicking to it and then to me, a question unspoken. I didn't move it. I made coffee, poured my cup, and went about the morning like it belonged there, because it did, not as evidence anymore, but as a reminder of a boundary that had been crossed and then corrected through consequence, not forgiveness or forgetting. When he left for work, he hesitated by the door, then said he'd be home on time, and I nodded, neither confirming nor questioning, because by then his promises were less important than his follow-through. As the day unfolded, messages came in from family about unrelated plans, schedules, birthdays, ordinary life reasserting itself, and I responded where needed, the tone lighter than it had been in weeks. The reckoning had run its course publicly and privately, not with applause or declarations, but with receipts, procedures, and the quiet acknowledgement of what had happened and what it had cost. That night, when I eventually turned the light back on and moved the paper into a folder with other important documents, it felt less like closing a chapter and more like filing something where it belonged, accessible if needed, but no longer front and center. The house settled again, not into what it had been before, but into something more deliberate, more honest in its limitations. And as I went upstairs, leaving the kitchen dark behind me, I understood that the justice in it all hadn't come from exposing him or winning an argument, but from insisting that shared things stay shared, that misuse be corrected, and that silence no longer be used as cover, because in the end, the consequences had spoken clearly enough on their own.